The scripture reading this morning is going to be the entirety of Matthew chapter 28. That is the entirety of Matthew chapter 28. Now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and came and rolled away the stone, and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. The guards shook for fear of him, and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who has been crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said. Come see the place where he was lying. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you." And they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to report it to his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and greeted them. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and take my word to my brethren, to leave for Galilee, and there they will see me." Now while they were on their way, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if they should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble." And they took the money and did as they'd been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. But the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age."
Thank you, Jonah, and thanks especially for extending that reading to the whole chapter. I sent him a note earlier this morning, and I said, "Hey, would you mind just read the whole chapter while you're at it?" I do not know of a Christian scholar who does, there may be some, but I don't know any of them, who does not believe that the resurrection of Jesus is the most important event in human history. It is the capstone of the doctrine that Jesus is not only the Christ, but he is the Son of God. That is demonstrated in the resurrection. There's no other way to explain it than Jesus must be the Son of God. One writer says the gospel without the resurrection is not merely a gospel without the final chapters. It's not a gospel at all. The gospel is the good news of Jesus, but that good news is only good news if Jesus is raised. Anthony read to us a bit ago from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I want to get Paul's take on the importance of the resurrection in chapter, 15, 1 Corinthians 15. And I want to read to you a section of that passage, but I want to read it to you from Eugene Peterson's translation, The Message. I think it drives home this point in modern language. He says, if there is no resurrection, Paul says, if there is no resurrection for Christ, everything we've told you is smoke and mirrors. And you have staked your life on smoke and mirrors. And if Christ wasn't raised, then all you're doing is wandering around in the dark, as lost as ever. If all we get out of Jesus is a little inspiration for a few short years, we're a pretty sorry lot. The very notion that Jesus might be a nice philosopher or a nice guy or a fellow who came and told us a really nice way to live, and if the world would just buy into the way that Jesus says we would have peace, but he's not the Son of God, that won't wash. Because Jesus is the Son of God, and it is demonstrated with the resurrection. The Christian world, including the non-Christian world, as a matter of fact, I was with our folks in Vietnam last evening by Zoom, and I said, "Do you know Easter in Vietnam?" "Oh, yeah. Yeah, we know Easter in Vietnam. Now here is a whole nation of people whose worship is fundamentally not Christian, and yet they're aware of Christmas and they're aware of Easter. That's the impact that Jesus has even on the non-Christian world. The non-Christian world, the Christian world calls today Easter Sunday. It is the day we mark as Jesus' resurrection from the dead. The interesting thing to me is that the New Testament writers do not refer to it that way. They never say Jesus rose from the dead on Easter. They never even say that Jesus rose from the dead 3 days after Passover, or 3 days after Passover. Instead, they always say Jesus rose from the dead when? On the first day of the week. And so we remember Jesus' death on the day that gives the death meaning, which is the first day of the week. It is the day of his resurrection. All of the gospel writers talk about the resurrection of Jesus. But this morning I want to talk about it from simply Matthew's perspective. Matthew begins his story where Mark and Luke and John also begin, early in the morning, on the first day of the week. He begins like they began, with a mention of the women. John just mentions one woman. It is Mary of Magdalene, or Mary Magdalene. That's it. To me, that story, I mentioned it this morning in our bulletin. To me, that story is the most emotional for me. And it's hard for me to get through it when I think about it, and I think about what must have been going through Mary's mind, and what she was thinking when she met up with Jesus, and how distraught that she was. John tells that story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that other women were involved besides Mary of Magdalene. Mark and Luke tell us that those women went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. But Matthew says, and I find this just incredibly interesting, that they went just to look at the tomb. They just went to look. I've been going through old papers and stuff and filing things and throwing stuff away, and I've come across pictures I didn't know I had. I came across a little picture of my grandfather, my father's father, and my grandmother, and I don't know where they were, at least I didn't know where they were. My oldest uncle, my father's older brother, he is standing at their feet, and my father is dressed in a little dress, because that's what they did to little boys back then. It's a wonder it didn't ruin them for life. But he's dressed in a little white dress, and he is sitting, my grandfather has him sort of perched in his arms on something. And as I looked at that picture this past week, I wondered, where in the world are they? I know this has got to be Murray, Kentucky, but where in Murray, Kentucky are they? So I continued to go through the files, and a couple of days went by, and I came across a photocopy of that piece of paper, and written at the bottom in either my mother's handwriting or my aunt's handwriting, my father's younger sister, who was not alive at the time the picture was made, there are these words. This is a picture of Ovi and Joe, my grandmother, my grandfather, and young Joe and Miles, that's my father, and Miles is sitting on top of the tombstone for my great-grandfather. Basil, I think, was his name. And I thought, wow, to have this stuff all these years and didn't know I had it, but now I know where that picture was made. And then I started to wonder, what in the world are they doing at a cemetery? And why are they taking pictures at a cemetery? That's an odd place to take a family photo. Now I know where Clayton gets it. You know, he loves to take photos in cemeteries and build stories on that kind of thing. But you know, that's what people did. It's what some people still do. Once a year, they go to the graves of their parents. They will go to think. They'll go to remember. They'll go to honor. They'll go to mourn. They'll go to clean around the grave. You ever seen an old cemetery that's all grown up? Well, if nobody's taking care of it, that's exactly what happens. And so they go and they take care of the grave. These women went to think. They went to remember. They went to mourn. I don't know what they expected to see. Maybe they didn't expect to see anything. But I know that what they saw wasn't certainly what they expected. If we took all the gospel accounts and put them all together, sort of in a chronological order, I'm not comfortable with doing that. I don't think the gospel writers intended us to do that. But if we do it, then we might come up with the notion that what happened on that Easter morning was that there was this great earthquake, and the women went out to inspect the tomb to make sure everything was okay. I don't know what good it would have done if it wasn't okay, but they went out to take a look. But if you just had Matthew, if you just take Matthew's view, the text says that they go to look at the tomb, and it's when they arrive there that there is the great earthquake, and Matthew says it is a great earthquake. Do you remember, some of you, the earthquake we had here a few years ago? Do you remember where you were? I know where I was on that day. I know exactly what I was doing on that day. And I got to tell you, I wasn't afraid. I just thought it was odd. It's the only earthquake I've ever been in. And if it had been a greater earthquake than that, it probably would have scared the daylights out of me. But this is a great earthquake. And it scares these women. And there is this angel who comes down and rolls away this stone and then sits on the top of it as if to say, there you go. The angel does not come down to roll away the stone so that Jesus can get out. The angel comes down to roll away the stone so that the women can get in. And the disciples can get in. And they can truly see that Jesus is gone. It is such a traumatic event, the Bible says, that the soldiers were afraid. They are quaking in their sandals. They can't move, but they can hear. And they heard this angel speak to the women who are afraid, and I know that they're afraid because the angel says what? Don't be afraid. Yeah, don't be afraid. Yes. You are looking for Jesus who was crucified, but he's not here. He is risen, just as he said. See for yourself. And then the angel says, you tell his disciples to go to Galilee. He's going to meet them there. Go to Galilee and meet Jesus there. And so when I read that this week, I kind of went off on a little tangent. I'll take you with me for a bit. Jesus had made the trip from Jerusalem to Galilee lots of times. If you only had Matthew, you'd think he only made it once. But if you got John, you know he made it at least 2 more times, and probably more times than that. I wondered which route Jesus took. First of all, I wondered if he walked. If the resurrected Lord, does he just teleport himself to Galilee? Is that the way it works? Or does he fly to Galilee, or does he walk? I choose to believe he walked. And if Jesus walked to Galilee, he walked for the first time in many years alone. I wondered if he greeted people along the way, if they greeted him. And they wouldn't know it was Jesus. If they knew the story of Jesus, and I'm confident that they did, they wouldn't have recognized him because they thought he was dead, right? So you don't expect to see Jesus there. And I wonder if Jesus, making his way to Galilee, I wonder if Jesus wondered whether the disciples would show up. There's always a little doubt about that, right? Will the disciples really believe? Will they? And you say, well, Jesus was God. Jesus knows everything. But Jesus is surprised on occasions at the attitudes and the actions of his disciples. But Jesus goes to Galilee in order to meet his disciples there. When Matthew tells this story, Matthew has at least 4 points to make. First of all, you should know there's an empty tomb. When the women leave, the soldiers too will look in the tomb. Sure enough, Jesus' body is gone. And now they know what? We're in trouble. We were specifically charged with the task of making sure that this guy did not get out of this tomb. And now he's gone. We don't know what to do about this. We don't know how this could possibly happen. And so they go and they tell the chief priests what has happened. That tomb is empty. I've been to the Holy Land one time, And in that trip, I got to visit two places that are thought to be the tomb of Jesus. One of them is the traditional spot everybody wants to go to. It's in a garden. It's what I imagine that area looked like in Jesus' day. It's probably not the tomb, but it's the one I like, so that's the one I focus on. And there is this opening in a mound of rock, and you walk inside, and there is this sort of like, it looks like a shelf, and it's empty. Nobody really knows where Jesus' tomb is. You know why? Because it wasn't worth remembering. Jesus wasn't there. He didn't stay there long enough. Jesus' tomb is empty, and Matthew emphasizes that point first in his text. But second, Jesus' body isn't just gone. Jesus is risen. He is alive. He has come forth from that tomb. Matthew records at least 4 times that Jesus made the claim that he would be killed, but that he would rise from the dead. And this has always caused people who study the Bible problems, because they, how can anybody possibly rise from the dead? And so they come up with all kinds of ways in order to deal with it, kind of like crossing the Red Sea. Some years ago, a guy came up with a notion that, well, what must have happened at the crossing of the Red Sea was that there was this big earthquake and somehow the sea parted. All right, but you don't know that. You can't prove that. You just don't like the fact that God parted the sea, and God parted the sea using Moses. You don't like the supernatural of it at all. And there are people who just don't like the supernatural of Jesus' resurrection. And so one of the things that's said is that, the women went to the wrong tomb. Women, they don't know. They're directionally challenged. I don't think that. Okay, don't take it up with me. Okay, but I think that would be an insult to women. I think it would be an insult to these women. They'd just been at that tomb 48 hours before. Would they have forgotten where it was? The disciples had been at that tomb as well. They go to the tomb. Did they go to the wrong one too? What about Joseph of Arimathea? It was his tomb. Did he not know where his own tomb was? And if he knew and he went to that tomb and it was empty, that clinches it. The notion that they just went to the wrong tomb simply will not fly. Another notion is that Jesus didn't really die. He just sort of fainted on the cross, and they took him down and put him in that tomb, and it was cool in the tomb, and the coolness revived him. But that flies in the face of all history. The text says that Jesus died. Pilate is a little flummoxed about Jesus' death. Normally, people don't die that quick. But you see, Jesus wasn't killed. Jesus died on his own accord. So he dies when he gets good and ready. And Pilate's a little frustrated at all this. He wants to know, did Jesus really die? And so he sends soldiers. And who would know what a dead body is like besides a soldier? Maybe a doctor, but soldiers have had all kinds of experience with dead bodies. They go and they come back and they say, yep, he's dead, that's for sure. Josephus, the Jewish historian, and Tacitus, the Roman historian, they both say that Jesus was killed on the order of Pontius Pilate. And remember that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus both go to tend to the body of Jesus. They would know whether Jesus was alive or whether or not he had just fainted. If Jesus really didn't die, the Jesus that the women saw and that his disciples saw would have been a substantially different Jesus from the one that they did see. One writer says it's impossible that a being who had crept half dead out of the tomb, who crept about weak and ill, needing medical attention, could have possibly given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and over the grave. And then there is this story that is only told by Matthew. He talks about another alternative. Matthew doesn't believe this alternative, but I think if you ask Matthew, he'd say, well, if you're going to have an alternative to Jesus dying, this would be it. It is that the disciples stole the body. Matthew's the only one who tells you this story. Matthew tells us that the chief priests had to pay the soldiers to say that the disciples stole the body. But it's an absurd plan on the face of it. If that's what happened, if that's really what happened, why would you have to pay the disciples to say that the disciples had stolen the body, if in point of fact the disciples had stolen the body? And if the disciples had stolen the body, how sound a sleeper would the soldiers have had to be not to have awakened while all of those disciples came and rolled that stone away? And if they were that sound asleep, how would they possibly know that it was the disciples who had done it? But finally, it would mean that the disciples had staked their lives and their future on a lie. It would have been a lie that cost them their life. People don't lie to put themselves into danger. But there is also the story of the women. Jesus met the women. They fell at his feet. They grabbed hold of him, like Mary Magdalene did in John's story. They didn't grab hold of a ghost, a spirit. They grabbed hold of a living, breathing human being, someone who has a body, and they worshiped him. There is the testimony of those women. He is raised from the dead. Third, Jesus' resurrection places an obligation on his disciples, on us as his disciples. The disciples, the 11, make the trip to Galilee. They go to the mountain where Jesus told them to go. And you need not think that they were all on the same page. As they made the trip to Galilee, they weren't all saying, man, I can't wait till we get there so we can see Jesus. Because Matthew tells you that some of them what? Doubted. I find that word interesting. It occurs only 2 times in the New Testament. The other time that it occurs is when Jesus is walking on the Sea of Galilee and the disciples see him, and Peter says, if that's really you, let me give this a whirl. And Jesus says, well, come on. And Peter gets out of the boat and he begins to walk on the water, but then he sees the waves and he hears the wind and he becomes what? Afraid. And Jesus says, why did you doubt? That word doubt has to do with fear. It's not that they doubt, well, we're going to go to Galilee, but I don't think we're going to see Jesus. I just don't believe in that. I think they all believed they were going to see Jesus. What they were afraid of is what Jesus was going to say to them. And here's what he said to them. All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. Matthew chapter 4, Satan says to Jesus, if you fall down and worship me, I will give you all of these kingdoms of the world. Jesus does not, but he receives authority anyway, but not just authority over the kingdoms of men, not just authority over the earth. He receives all authority in heaven and on earth. And then he tells the disciples what? You go. You make disciples. And that's exactly what some of those disciples were afraid of. That's why they go doubting. This same gospel that Jesus has been preaching, that gospel that got him killed, that's the gospel he wants us to go preach. What's going to happen to us? You're going to get killed too. Exactly right. It is the same obligation that Jesus places on us because he is risen. He is alive. You go and you make disciples. There are places in our world where doing that is really, really dangerous. There are people waiting to kill you. If you go and you speak the message of Jesus, they'll take your life. They'll do it with impunity and they'll get away with it. But it's not true here. It's not true here. Oh, here they'll make fun of you. Here they'll brand you. That's another one of those fundamentalist, Christians. Here they'll say that you're some kind of religious nut. Here they will separate themselves from you because they don't want much of this religion stuff, and they don't want to be around anybody who's very religious, but they won't kill you. Knowing that, should we not all rethink our attitude to this obligation Jesus places on us to go and to share the good news of a risen Lord? Not that we ought to back out of it, because we already backed out of it. So that we will get into it, so that we will begin to do it. But there is a final point, and it's equally important with all of the rest. The assurance of a risen Lord, one whom not even death could keep in the ground, no matter what is happening in our life, that assurance that the risen Lord is here with us always. Jesus says, I will be with you always. On the one hand, it's an uncomfortable thought that wherever I go and whatever I do, because I'm a disciple of the Lord, Jesus is there with me, seeing what I'm doing and listening to what I'm saying. Because not always what I do and what I say is something I really want Jesus to know. But I am glad that Jesus is raised. And I am glad that He is a Christ of grace. And I am glad that He is with me always, protecting me, watching over me, leading me home to be with Him. Clark, you lead us in our final song.